There are nights in rock and roll history that refuse to be forgotten. Nights that arrive wrapped in doubt, carrying the weight of 1,000 predictions of failure, and then detonate into something so undeniable that even the people who wanted the story to end differently have no choice but to go quiet. The night of September 25, 1981, at JFK Stadium in Philadelphia was one of those nights. 90,000 people stood in the dark waiting. The critics had already written their verdicts. The music press had already sharpened their knives. And somewhere beneath that massive stage, in the electric silence before the first chord, Mick Jagger was getting ready to prove every single one of them wrong. But to understand what that night meant, you have to understand what was supposed to happen to Mick Jagger. You have to understand what the world had decided about him, about rock and roll, about the era he represented. Because the story of that performance is not just about a concert. It is about survival. It is about what happens when a man who has been written off walks toward the thing that was supposed to destroy him and refuses to flinch. The cultural landscape of popular music was shifting so violently that entire careers were being swallowed overnight. Disco had consumed the mainstream, and when disco itself collapsed under the weight of its own backlash, something new rushed in to fill the vacuum. Punk had already detonated in the United Kingdom and sent shockwaves through the music industry. And in its wake, New Wave was rewriting the rules of what cool sounded like, what it looked like, what it meant. Synthesizers were replacing guitars. Youth was replacing experience. The angular energy of bands like Blondie, Talking Heads, and The Cars was setting a new temperature for popular music. And that temperature had very little patience for anything that looked like it belonged to the previous decade. The Rolling Stones by 1980 looked like exactly that, a band from the previous decade, a relic. The music press, which had once celebrated them as the world's greatest rock and roll band, was now circling with a different kind of interest. The kind of interest a culture shows toward something it has decided is finished. Words like dinosaur and legacy act were appearing in the same sentences as the Rolling Stones, and those words were not meant as compliments. They were meant as conclusions. And the attacks were not only about musical relevance. The internal fractures within the Rolling Stones had become public knowledge. The tension between Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, which had always been the dark engine powering the band's creativity, had grown into something uglier and more complicated. There were public disagreements, contradictory interviews, rumors of a split that would never be repaired. The band that had survived the 1960s, the death of Brian Jones, the chaos of Altamont, the drug arrests and the court appearances, and the years of excess. That band was now struggling with something more ordinary and somehow more dangerous than any of those catastrophes. It was struggling with the question of whether it still mattered. But here is what the critics misread, and what they almost always misread about Mick Jagger specifically. They confused his public persona with his actual nature. They saw the swagger and assumed it was the whole of him. They saw the spectacle and assumed there was nothing structural holding it up. They had never understood, or perhaps never wanted to understand, that the man who moved like lightning across a stage was also the man quietly studying spreadsheets, tour logistics, audience demographics, and the mechanics of how a rock and roll band survives not just one decade but several. Mick Jagger had always been two things simultaneously. He was the rebel and the strategist. He was the chaos and the architect of the chaos. And when everyone around him was telling him the era was over, he was already thinking about how to prove them wrong in the most spectacular way possible. The answer was a tour. Not a modest, apologetic return to clubs or theaters, but a full-scale American stadium tour that would be, at the time it was announced, the largest ever undertaken by any rock band in history, the Tattoo You Tour. The ambition of it was almost offensive given the climate. Critics who heard the announcement treated it like a joke. Or worse, like a desperate attempt by an aging band to recapture relevance by throwing money and logistics at a problem that was fundamentally creative. They said the music wasn't there. They said the energy wasn't there. They said Mick Jagger at 38 years old could not possibly deliver what he had delivered at 22. What they did not know, or did not allow themselves to consider, was what Mick Jagger had been doing in the months leading up to that tour. The preparation was methodical in a way that would have surprised anyone who still believed that his performances were spontaneous eruptions of natural talent. He was studying, he was training. He was watching footage of his own previous performances with an almost clinical detachment, identifying what worked, what had changed, what needed to be rebuilt. He was working with choreographers. He was running. He was studying the physical demands of performing on stages so large that the performer at the center risks disappearing entirely unless they have learned how to use every inch of space, every degree of light, every moment of silence as deliberately as every moment of sound. He was also thinking about what the show needed to say, not just what songs would be played, but what the overall experience would communicate to the 90,000 people who would stand in the dark watching it. What is the argument this show is making? That question, which might seem like the concern of a filmmaker or a philosopher rather than a rock singer, was exactly the kind of question Mick Jagger asked himself. The tour needed to be not just a concert but a statement, a declaration that rock and roll was not finished, that the Rolling Stones were not finished, that he was not finished. And then there was the album. Tattoo You was released in August of 1981, just weeks before the tour began, and it did something that the critics had not predicted. It worked. Start Me Up, the opening track, hit the radio with a force that felt less like a song and more like an argument. The guitar riff was immediate, physical, and completely without apology. It was not trying to sound like new wave. It was not trying to sound contemporary in the way that contemporary was being defined in 1981. It sounded like the Rolling Stones, which was exactly its point. And audiences responded to it in a way that made the music press pause and reconsider. But a hit song and a tour announcement are one thing. Standing in front of 90,000 people and making the performance match the promise is another thing entirely. September 25th arrived like a test that had been building for 2 years. JFK Stadium in Philadelphia held nearly 100,000 people at capacity. The crowd that gathered that evening was enormous, loud, and carrying with it the specific tension of an audience that has come not just to see a show, but to witness a verdict. People who believed that Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones were still the greatest rock band in the world had come to see their faith confirmed. People who had read the critical obituaries had come to see whether those obituaries were accurate. And some people, the kind who are drawn to moments of high cultural stakes, had simply come because they could feel, in the way crowds sometimes can feel before the fact, that something significant was about to happen. The opening of the show was not subtle. The stage setup was deliberately, almost aggressively large. The lighting rigs were designed to make the scale of the event feel intentional rather than excessive, a distinction that matters enormously in live performance. When the lights went down and the crowd noise reached a pitch is difficult to describe in any language except the language of physical sensation. And then the first notes hit the air. What happened was not a concert beginning. It was a conversation starting. A very loud, very physical, very one-sided conversation in which Mick Jagger was doing all the talking. He came onto that stage and immediately demonstrated the thing that his critics had never understood and that no other performer of his generation had ever quite replicated. He understood that a stage is not a platform, a stage is a territory, and the way you move through that territory communicates something to the audience that the music alone cannot. Every step, every turn, every extension of the arm and tilt of the head and shift of the hips is a sentence in a language that bypasses the rational mind entirely and lands somewhere more primal. Audiences do not think about why Mick Jagger's stage presence works. They feel it before they have the chance to think. And on that September night in Philadelphia, 90,000 people felt it at the same moment. The set list was built with the precision of a legal argument. Each song was placed not just for its individual impact, but for what it contributed to the cumulative effect of the whole. The opening moments established energy and authority. The middle sections balanced familiarity with surprise. The final movement built towards something that every person in that stadium could feel coming, a culmination that felt both inevitable and somehow unexpected. This is not an accident when it happens at this level. This is craft, and Mick Jagger had been practicing it for nearly 2 decades. What reporters and photographers captured that night, and what has been preserved in interviews and accounts from people who were present, is a portrait of a performer operating at the absolute peak of his abilities. Not the peak of his youth, because youth is not the same as peak, and anyone who has watched enough great performers understands the difference. This was the peak of mastery. The peak of a man who had spent 20 years learning exactly what he was capable of and was now demonstrating it without any of the uncertainty that accompanies the early stages of a career. The physical stamina alone was remarkable enough to silence the critics who had suggested that his age was a limitation. He moved across that stage for 2.5 hours with an intensity that left many performers half his age looking, studied by comparison. But the stamina was almost beside the point, because what the audience was responding to was not simply the quantity of movement, but the quality of attention behind it. Every gesture had intention, every pause had purpose. Even the moments that looked most spontaneous, most off the cuff, most genuinely wild, were rooted in a performer's instinct that had been sharpened over thousands of shows until it operated at a speed that no conscious thought could match. There is a moment that multiple witnesses have described from that night, and it has the quality of a scene from a film rather than a memory from a concert, which may be why it has survived so clearly in the accounts of people who were there. Somewhere in the middle of the set, during a particularly raw and driving performance of one of the band's older songs, Mick Jagger stopped moving for a fraction of a second. Not long enough to read as hesitation, just long enough to read as choice. He stood at the front of that enormous stage, lit from above, 90,000 people pressing forward in the dark, and the silence between one phrase and the next lasted just a moment longer than it had to. And in that moment, the crowd held its breath, not because they were waiting for the next lyric, but because they were in the presence of someone who understood that silence is part of the instrument, who understood that what you withhold can be as powerful as what you deliver. Then he moved again, and the crowd exhaled, and the concert continued. And nobody who was there that night would ever quite describe it the same way twice, but all of them would remember the feeling of it, the feeling of watching someone command 90,000 people with the pause between 2 notes. The reviews that came out the following morning did something that reviews rarely do in the history of popular music criticism. They reversed themselves. The journalists who had been sharpening their conclusions about the end of the Rolling Stones found themselves writing different sentences than the ones they had prepared. Words like unstoppable and irreplaceable started appearing where words like dinosaur had been. The consensus shifted not slowly but almost immediately, the way a weather system can change in hours, because the evidence was simply too large and too specific to argue with. But beyond the reviews, beyond the critical consensus, something else happened in the weeks and months that followed the Tattoo You tour, something that operated at a level beneath critical language and above individual concerts. The culture began to process what it had witnessed and reached a conclusion that the critics had resisted. That rock and roll, in the hands of someone who had truly understood it and made it their life's work, was not subject to the same mortality that governed fashion and trend. That there was a kind of performance, a kind of presence, that existed outside the cycles of what was new and what was finished. Mick Jagger had not simply survived the challenge of 1981, he had transformed it. He had taken the moment that was supposed to be his diminishment and turned it into one of the defining performances of his career. He had looked at the gap between what the critics expected and what he knew he could deliver, and had made that gap the subject of the show. The subtext of every song on that tour was the same: you were wrong about what this is, and I am going to demonstrate exactly how wrong for 2.5 hours in front of as many people as I can fit in a single location. This is the thing about Mick Jagger that has always been most difficult for his critics to account for. He is not simply a performer. He is a performer who understands performance as a discipline, as a practice that requires the same kind of rigorous ongoing commitment that a surgeon or a scientist brings to their work. The wild image was never the whole story. It was always the visible surface of something more structural. Beneath the performance was a man who studied, who prepared, who analyzed, who learned, who looked at what had worked and what had failed and asked himself relentlessly how to do it better. And beneath even that was something harder to name but essential to understand. A refusal, a deep, personal, almost constitutional refusal to accept the version of his story that other people were trying to write. The music press in 1981 had written a story in which Mick Jagger was a figure from the past, a man whose moment had come and gone, whose relevance was historical rather than living. And Mick Jagger walked onto that stage in Philadelphia and tore that story up in front of 90,000 witnesses. The musicians who were watching that tour, the younger artists who were at the time being held up as the future of rock and roll while the Rolling Stones were being consigned to its past, have spoken in interviews over the years about what it meant to them to see that performance. The word they return to most often is not technical. It is not about the specific songs or the stage design or even the physical energy. The word they return to is belief. He made you believe, they say. He made you believe that it was real, that it mattered, that the music was not a product or a performance but something alive and necessary. And that quality, the quality of making an audience believe, is not something you can learn from a textbook or purchase with a production budget. It is the rarest thing in performance, and Mick Jagger possessed it in such quantities that he could project it across a football stadium and have it land in the chest of every individual person in the crowd. The Tattoo You tour went on to become the highest grossing rock tour in history up to that point. The numbers were significant, but the numbers were almost incidental to what the tour actually accomplished. What it accomplished was a redefinition of what was possible for a rock band that had been in existence for nearly 20 years. It established a template that would be referenced by every major touring artist for the next 4 decades. It demonstrated that scale and intimacy were not opposites, that a performer could command a stadium crowd and still make each individual in that crowd feel directly addressed. And it sent an unmistakable message to every critic who had declared the era finished. The era is finished when the performer says it is finished, and this performer has not yet finished speaking. There is a photograph from that tour that has become one of the most reproduced images in rock and roll history. Mick Jagger at the front of the stage, caught in mid-movement, lit by a single hard spotlight against the darkness of the stadium behind him. He is not young in the photograph. The lines of his face are visible, the lived-in quality of a man who has been many places and done many things. But what the photograph captures, what makes it impossible to look at without feeling something, is the quality of forward motion. He is leaning into something. He is moving towards something. He is going somewhere, and it is perfectly clear that he has no intention of stopping. That image is not just a photograph of a rock concert. It is an image of what refusal looks like when it is practiced at the highest possible level. refusal to shrink, refusal to apologize, refusal to perform the decline that everyone else had scripted for him, refusal, most of all, to believe that the story was over when there was still so much left to say. In the years that followed the Tattoo You tour, the Rolling Stones would continue to tour, continue to record, continue to exist as a force in the cultural landscape with a persistence that defied every actuarial and cultural prediction. They would play stadiums when stadiums were the expected venue, and they would fill them. They would release albums when albums seemed like relics, and people would still listen. They would survive personnel changes, personal tragedies, creative disagreements of extraordinary bitterness, and the simple passage of time that has a way of eroding everything it touches. And through all of it, the image of Mick Jagger that endured was not the image of a young man discovering his power. It was the image of a man in full command of what he had built, unwilling to let it become only a memory. Every performer who has come after him, everyone who has stood at the front of a massive stage and felt the pressure of that many eyes and that much expect owes something to what Mick Jagger proved in 1981. He proved that endurance is not just surviving. Endurance is showing up better than anyone expected. It is taking the night when the world has decided to write your ending and making it the night they have to rewrite their beginning. 90,000 people went home from JFK Stadium in Philadelphia that September night with something more than the memory of a concert. They went home with the evidence of something they had not fully believed before they arrived, that the greatest rock and roll frontman who had ever lived was still the greatest rock and roll frontman who had ever lived, and that whatever the future held, it would have to contend with him on his own terms. The critics had said rock was dead. The critics had said Jagger was finished. And Mick Jagger had done what Mick Jagger has always done when the world tells him what he cannot be. He walked to the front of the stage, let the light find him, and started moving.